It's the end of the day with Ray. Hello, my friends. Well, today we're going to jump on that Sharp Interactive board. I want to dig a little bit deeper into the geopolitical arena, and I want to discuss more about these Chinese Communist Party-owned technology companies. And folks, there's a lot of rhetoric around this, and there's a lot of talk, and it's heating up. We got more and more senators talking on the floor about this. We got governors around the country putting together executive orders regarding this subject. And quite honestly, folks, I think a lot of people are focused on one of the threats. With doing business with Chinese-owned companies. There's another threat that I don't think we talk about near enough, and today I want to share my thoughts on that second threat. And I'm hoping after today's episode, it'll expand some more conversations around this. Because, ladies and gentlemen, the second threat that I'm going to bring up today, I think is just as serious as the first one. So let's talk about the first threat first. The threat that everybody's talking about. And I'm going to sum it up like this. I'm a government agency here in the United States, and you can see on these screens I put different logos for different government agencies. I'm a state agency, if you will. I'm a federal government agency, if you will, and I'm using Lenovo computers, and that information is slipping through the firewall and going back to the Chinese government. I'm using Lexmark printers, and I'm scanning information into the Lexmark cloud, and all that's going back to the Chinese government. Ladies and gentlemen, I got to say this. We would all hope that here in the free world, whether it's the United States or any part of the free world, that we have firewalls in place to protect that from happening. I realize there's been some stories out there where some of that's happened, supposedly. Slipped through the firewall, got over to the Chinese government. What information's leaving that Lenovo computer and ended up in hands in the Chinese government? What information's leaving those scanners from those Lexmark printers and ending up in the Chinese government hands? That is a question, and hopefully the cyber experts around the world will always look at that question. Okay, we'll always look at that question. Because, folks, there's two things going on regarding China. You got manufacturing going on from companies that are not Chinese-owned, but they manufacture in China. And then you have Chinese-owned companies that manufacture, obviously, in China. That's two different worlds. And I'm going to tell you something. We're not going to end the manufacturing of technology products in China anytime soon. That's gonna linger on for a while until more and more factories get built outside of communist China. And we're starting to see more of that happen. But at the end of the day, let's focus on the Chinese-owned companies that are manufacturing in China and then selling that into the free world. And now, I want to talk to you about the second threat. So like I said, let's just assume that we got firewalls in place and we can prevent that Lenovo from sending information over in the hands of the Chinese government, and we can do the same thing on the printers from Lexmark. But folks, I want us to think about this. Let me just read this to you. The bigger concern is the distraction and overemphasizing the security regarding the equipment. We need to understand the realities behind the business communications between the China and non-China geographies regarding the Chinese-owned companies. So I want you to think about it this way. Here's Lexmark's headquarters in Lexington, Kentucky. Well, we know that 9-Star owns Lexmark, and this is basically just a branch office for 9-Star, okay? This isn't some American company that's headquartered in Lexington, Kentucky. It's owned by 9-Star, and 9-Star, we all know who the boss is. Well, it's the Chinese government, and there's the leader. So I want to ask everybody a question. What kind of information does Lexmark have to send the boss back in China? And you see, a lot of y'all are thinking that it's all about the customer information. We're going to get all the documents they scan, and we're going to get all the stuff they maybe use on a Lenovo computer, if you will. Let's talk about the business itself. Here's some examples. Does the Chinese dictator tell Lexmark, hey, I need copies of all the government contracts on all of our equipment. Make sure you get those copies to us. We got to look through those copies. I need the email addresses that you have on all of your customers. Because there are customers. We own the company. What information are they asking Lexmark to give them? Ladies and gentlemen, here's the problem. When we think about data, we try to define what they're going to use the data for, and I've talked about this before. But any data is valuable. Because the folks that mine the data that they're given, or that they get, they have more of an imagination most of the times than the people that are giving them the data. And so the question is, for all these folks that are selling in the free world products and technology that are owned by the Chinese government, what information, what business information are you sending over to China? I think it would be nice to know. I think everybody needs to know. What does Lexmark send the Chinese government regarding the business? What information are they getting? Folks, just use your imagination of what they could be getting. And as they start collecting all of this data, what are they going to use that data for? I can imagine a whole lot of things. And I think we need to start having this question asked more and more. Ladies and gentlemen, this next slide is for all my friends that are in the leasing business. Because the impacts of what's going on, especially I think with some of these executive orders we're starting to see pop up, I want to talk about the non-appropriations clause, and let me just ask leasing companies a question. Leasing companies, are the non-appropriations contracts at risk? Now, for some of my friends that don't know what a non-appropriations clause is in a lease agreement, a non-appropriation clause allows termination of the contract if the governing body fails to budget funds for the ongoing contract. Failure to include this clause when required can invalidate the contract. So let's just say that a state has a 5-year contract on Lexmark printers, and they're loving it. I mean, they went in there and they sold a whole bunch of printers to this state. And then one day, that governor of that state woke up and he got a little freaked out about the threat from the Chinese-owned companies. And he says, you know what? I'm going to write an executive order and ban Lexmark from being involved with any government office. Effective immediately. Would that violate the contract? Because obviously, that state office wouldn't be able to renew the annual contract because it was outlawed. So therefore, there would be no funding allowed to participate in something that the governor signed an executive order on. Folks, if you don't think this is something you need to be paying attention to, I strongly suggest you do. I strongly suggest that leasing companies start asking this question. I strongly suggest that my dealer friends that might be doing really big government deals and self-funding those, they might want to ask this question. What happens if all of a sudden, through an executive order, that office, that government agency, isn't going to use that equipment anymore? Maybe that school district isn't going to use that equipment anymore. We need to be asking that question. We need to figure this out and figure it out quick. Because, folks, we're already starting to see some executive orders. We haven't seen the real teeth in them yet. But that doesn't mean that the real teeth in these executive orders isn't coming soon. Something to think about for sure. I want to ask everybody a question. When does the money become less important than the principle? When does the money become less important than the principle? Because it's really all about the money. And you'll hear, there might be some criticism of today's episode where people will say, oh, Ray, he's a conspiracy theorist and this is all nuts and there's no information going back to China. And they're going to defend the folks over at Lenovo and some of these companies. They're going to defend what they're doing, and I don't blame them for doing that. They're all employed. They all make money. There's an issue with that, and I think I got a solution. I'll share that at the end of today's episode. In the meantime, we must know the realities. Ignoring them is no longer an option. I think these discussions need to be had more of. I think the leaders of the industry need to be having these discussions and having them quite frequently. I think when we all show up at some of these association meetings, maybe we could put to bed some of the nonsense we talk about. Maybe we could skip giving out everybody the BLI awards as an example and really focus on some reality, real problems that are addressing our industry. Maybe we could bring in some experts around geopolitics to talk about this with our dealers. Because, ladies and gentlemen, this is a big deal. And there's so many implications. It's not just about the Chinese companies and their headquarters around the free world. It's about the dealers that sell those products and how they might get impacted. It's about the leasing companies, as I just shared. This affects the entire industry. This affects the end users. And folks, here's what I got to tell you all, and you have to pay attention to this. I said it before in another episode. But sooner or later, the rhetoric, and when end users start seeing executive orders, and they start thinking to themselves, well, I know that, Lexmark says they're real secure, but why don't I just eliminate the threat altogether and just not buy the Lexmark? I know Lenovo, they say they're secure and everything, but why don't I just eliminate the threat altogether and not buy Lenovo? That's an impact. That's an impact on all the employees that work at those organizations. That's extremely impactful to our industry, and we don't talk about it enough. This article I put out there on LinkedIn this week, and I found this. It was in Newsweek. It's an opinion article by James Spider Marks, retired Major General. A retired Major General has some pretty big concerns. I'm going to read some of this article for you, my friends, because I think it's important. It's important that our industry start investigating this past the conversations. I don't worry about it because our printers have security features. I don't worry about it because our computers are safe. Let's start listening to all of the conversations, the ones we don't agree with or like, as much as the ones we like and we agree with. As a former Army intelligence general, I shared America's contempt at the sight of a Chinese spy balloon flying above the United States earlier this month. It was a brazen symbol of disrespect for American sovereignty and our world-class detection capabilities. More troubling is it was the tip of the Chinese espionage iceberg inside the U.S. China is everywhere. Operations targeting American politicians and theft of commercial information of American companies are just two deeply established and frankly successful lines of effort. While American leaders are thankfully working to close these security gaps, they are still paying inadequate attention to a major vulnerability at the state level. U.S. governments have purchased millions of dollars worth of technology manufactured by companies beholden to Beijing. This is a reality. I'm going to ask this again in a different way, my friends. When do opinions become reason to eliminate the opinionated threat? So in other words, look, when the end users, the buyers of products get to a point where they think to themselves, why don't we just eliminate the threat altogether? That will impact our industry in a really, really strong way. And I think we need to really start thinking about this hard. Let me read some more of this. Federal national security agencies understand the risk of companies such as Lexmark, Lenovo, Hikvision, and DJI. The Marine Corps discovered in 2008 that Lenovo laptops were sending back data back to China. A Marine Network Operations officer testifying in court about the matter stated a large amount of Lenovo laptops were sold to the U.S. military that had a chip encrypted on the motherboard that would record all the data that was being inputted into the laptop and sent back to China. That was a huge security breach. In 2019, the Department of Defense Inspector General labeled Lenovo and Lexmark products known security risks. So they labeled known security risk. The entire federal government was banned from purchasing Hikvision products, primarily surveillance cameras, that same year. In 2018, the Pentagon banned purchases from drone maker DJI, and the Department of Homeland Security warned that DJI was providing U.S. critical infrastructure law enforcement data to the Chinese government. People hear this kind of stuff, and I realize these are things that people are saying, okay? But at the end of the day, when do the end users realize to themselves, maybe I shouldn't have to worry about mitigating the threat, why don't I just eliminate the threat altogether and stop buying the product? Let me just wrap it up with a little bit more of this article. The good news is that the momentum to confront these threats is building at state level. By CTT's account, in 2020, only a single state, Vermont, had pursued legislation to restrict U.S. states from buying technology manufactured by a Chinese-owned or operated company. In 2022, that number had risen to 5, and today is at least 11. So we see the momentum. 11 states, folks. New policies launched in Georgia and Florida in 2022 have fueled the flurry of states working on legislation prohibiting Chinese-owned or operated companies from participating in state contracts. Georgia SB 346 has even served as model legislation, which the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC, the nation's largest network of state legislatures, has promulgated into the members. But both the Georgia law and the ALEC legislation retain a loophole that allows third-party vendors to continue selling Chinese gear to the states. That flaw must be remedied, and the legislators in other states must be careful not to repeat that mistake as they draft their own new bills. Folks, Major General James Spider Okay, his final posting in uniform was the commanding general of the U.S. Army in Arizona. Folks, here's the reality. This conversation, it is a conversation that's going to make people think. And it's going to make people think in ways a lot of us don't want them to think. Let's talk a little bit more about where we're at with the government here in the United States on this subject. We all know Marco Rubio, Senator out of Florida. He's been spearheading a lot of conversations around Chinese-owned technology companies for a long time. He's very outspoken on that. In the same state that he resides, the governor just signed Executive Order 2216. Folks, it's about 9 pages. Google it. Look at this executive order. But let me just read section 1 here. I direct DMS to promulgate rules pursuant to section 120.54 Florida statute and take any additional agency action necessary consistent with the constitutional laws of Florida, the United States, to ensure commodities and services used by state and local governments are not susceptible to exploitation by foreign countries of concern as defined in. Folks, here's the reality. I want everybody to think about this. I don't like to predict who might win political environments. Who cares? Politics is politics. And in the United States, I don't think it matters what side of the fence anybody's on. There's a big disdain for Chinese-owned technology companies going on throughout the free world right now. But could you imagine if a governor that's out there putting executive orders in place one day became the president? Now that executive order is going to do what? It's going to apply to the whole country. Could you imagine if that outspoken senator that's in that same state became like Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State? Ladies and gentlemen, I think the issue is only going to get more robust in conversation, regardless of who might be in the White House or who might not be. I think the conversation is going to get more robust regardless of what part of the world you're in, as long as you're in the free world. People are extremely concerned about Chinese-owned technology companies. But I want us all to start thinking about the other threat. It's not just about the technology itself sending off information to the Communist Party, to the Chinese leader. It's about what directives is that Chinese government giving these companies in the offices around the free world. What are they having to send back? We need to understand exactly what that is, because like I said, data, well, the people that collect the data, well, the way they mine it, they're a lot more imaginative than you might be. Folks, let's just wrap it up with this. We can see that Kentucky Senate passes the bill to ban TikTok from state devices. We saw something come out yesterday from President Biden doing the same thing on a national level. So we have to ask ourselves the question, when does this Kentucky Senate pass a bill regarding our friends at Lexmark? When does the state start passing bills regarding Lenovo or any of these other Chinese-owned technology companies? A lot to think about in today's episode, but I hope we can broaden the conversation, especially at our association. We need to start talking about things that really matter and leave all the nonsense behind. Because everybody watching me knows this: status quo is the killer of all that'll be invented. Don't get stuck in status quo, and I'll see y'all tomorrow.